Good morning and welcome to Disability in Wisconsin, to our webinar on Framework for Building a Disability Inclusive Workforce. My name is Tracy Andrus and I am your host for today, and I'm just really proud to be here. I am the EVP of Strategy and Partnerships for Wrangham Consultants, and I'm a board member with Disability in Wisconsin. So brief overview on our session today and a little bit about Wrangham. So Wrangham is a woman-owned minority disability certified workforce solutions company. And we have a philosophy of empathy drives innovation in everything that we do, and it influences our programs and our services that we provide to our clients and our candidates. And we specialize in attracting and retaining talent globally in IT, engineering, scientific, clinical, healthcare, administrative, and finance and business professional, while integrating veterans and individuals with disabilities into our workforce. Today, I'm thrilled that we have the opportunity to be able to share with you an amazing panel of speakers and to focus on our framework for building a disability inclusive organization. This session will outline the core components of disability inclusion workplace, along with a menu of strategies for achieving it and beginning and building an inclusive culture. So with that, I would like to go ahead and introduce our opening speaker. And before I do that, I want to thank our panelists that we have today, which we have joining us, and a big shout out to Jennifer Houston, who's kind of our navigator behind the scenes here and helping and working with us as well, which is the Director of Missions and Operations at Goodwill. Along with Jennifer, we have Erica, who will be on the panel, Eichmans, and she's the Supervisor of IPS and Community Employment of Goodwill. John Bryson, he's a colleague of mine, and he's the Director of Learning and Development for Wrangham Consultants. And now to our opening speaker, which is Wendy. And Wendy, I'm proud to be able to present Wendy Strobel-Gower, who is the Thomas P. Golden Director of Disability Inclusive Workplaces and Employer Initiatives at Cornell University. Wendy's professional work focuses on interpreting disability laws and regulations for application to workplace policy and practices. And I'm going to have Wendy share a little bit more about what she does, because she does a lot more of what she does. And so I'm going to turn it over to you, Wendy, and thank you so much.
Hi, everyone. Yeah, with higher ed, you get a lot of hats, right? So I work at Cornell University. We're part of the School of Industrial and Labor Relations at an institute called the Yang Tan Institute on Employment and Disability. So I'm on the executive team for the center, but I also run a couple of grant projects, which is how I am here. So one of them is the Employer Assistance and Resource Network, or EARN. You have probably seen our materials on askearn.org. And I'm also the director of the Northeast ADA Center, serving New York, New Jersey, Puerto Rico, and the US Virgin Islands. So a little bit of a different area than Wisconsin. We're going to go through EARN's Inclusion at Work framework. If you go to the next slide, that's our title, and you go to the next one. So the Inclusion at Work framework was developed with input from business, who really do a lot of work in this area. If you can go back just one slide, Jennifer, that'd be great. Thank you. That's the web link to it, where you can find it on our site. The framework has 7 core components, each of which is invaluable in creating a culture that includes people with disabilities. It's really difficult to get where you want to go in terms of an inclusive workplace without paying attention to every single one of these. We have tons of material on our website that supports learning in this area. So after the webinar, I encourage you to go and visit and learn more about it. If you can then go to the next slide. I will tell you, I'm not going to dive too deeply into any one of these, because the speakers who are following me will dive in a little deeper on these. But there is time for Q&A at the end. So if people have questions about what I say, I think you can ask them then. So the first segment of the Inclusion at Work framework is called Lead the Way, and it's about creating inclusive cultures. It's really about what does the research tell us about creating that culture where everyone feels like they're included. And it's a really critical first step. So this is the part where you say, we don't do disability to comply with the law. We do disability because it ensures that all of our workers are welcome, that everyone is able to bring their whole selves to work, right? We've all heard that before. But what it really does is it creates a sense of safety for your employees, and it helps them feel like no matter what they bring to work, this is a place where they are safe. And it helps that build that sense of safety for not just people with disabilities, but for everyone in your organization. The other thing you have to do is make a decision that you're going to include disability inclusion as a corporate value. So it's not about compliance, it's about who we are as a company and what we believe. And we believe that people with disabilities should be included in the workplace. And so that's a very clear statement that you make, and you make it in a lot of places. You have your leaders make it, you put it on your website, you put it in your marketing, you build information that supports that mission through the other sections of the framework. And that really works to change the focus of disability inclusion from compliance to commitment to your employees, which again is the critical first step. Saying you care, writing it on a website is only step one. It has to flow from there. You have to do the rest of the steps. Okay, go on to the next slide. I feel like I'm lecturing you. I don't mean to. I just want you to understand that this is really to get to a place of safety for people, to get to a place where I can be free to say, yes, I self-identify as a person with a disability. And I'm not afraid of repercussions. You really, really, really have to push the needle on the lead the way portion of this. So really, we're trying to get to a place where I can be fully represent who I am, where I don't have to hide part of me. If you look into research on identity and the consequences of hiding an identity at work, it creates untold amounts of stress for people who are trying to hold back part of themselves or not share part of themselves or worry about the consequences if someone finds out their secret, right? I can tell you, being in a workplace that was not disability inclusive in my past, and I happened to get sick, and I went and told my boss, okay, so I don't know what's going on. I have some health issues that are going on, and I just wanted to let you know in the event that I need to take time off to go to the doctor or whatever. And what they said to me was, I guess we can't give you the hard jobs anymore. And I'm like, wait a minute. What changed from yesterday when you could give me hard jobs to today when now you can't? The only thing that changes in that scenario is the employer's perception of what I'm capable of. But that's the consequence of not having a workplace where people can be fully themselves. So now that I'm done lecturing you, I will talk about some strategies for establishing that disability inclusive culture. Your leaders are your champions. So finding a leader who's experienced disability or is a family member with disability, who's willing to share. Disability does not mean weakness. Disability means creativity. It means strength. It means an ability to adapt is really important because it kind of sets that tone of why it's a value for you, why you believe in it. I think the next step is making sure that you're, walking the talk, right? So making sure that your physical environment is accessible, making sure that people can access your systems easily. It's really hard to say, I believe in hiring people with disabilities, and then your recruiting website's not accessible and they can't even get in or have to call HR and disclose a disability to even get into that hiring system. So online access is just as, if not more important than physical access these days. And we're going to talk a lot today about employee resource groups. They are a really critical component, and built right, they can really help to build that culture from both the top down with your leaders and the bottom up, where you're actually getting feedback of how are you really doing around creating that space that's safe for everybody to be themselves. All right, go on to the next slide. Oh, next we're going to talk about outreach and recruitment. And again, I just will touch on this briefly because I think Erica is going to talk about this in a little bit. But really, building the pipeline is about recruiting and hiring people with disabilities. And we all know that talent shortages today are killing a lot of employers. They can't get the people they need to operate the way that they want to. So building a talent pipeline where you have a ready source of people who are willing to work is really, really important. It really takes a concerted effort to identify and cultivate relationships with entities and organizations capable of sourcing qualified candidates in all of the locations in which you operate. A lot of these community rehab providers who serve people with disabilities don't operate everywhere. You can work with people like is it CSEVR? I don't know, the NET, the one that Kathy West Evans runs. And they can connect you to VR locally, but you can also work with a community rehab provider who's willing to create those connections to benefit your company, who's willing to reach out to other disability service providers and say, if we do this together, we can build a meaningful pipeline of candidates for people for this company. And that's what they need. And really, all of these services should be about meeting employer needs, but also serving the person with a disability and making sure that there's a good match between the two so that they can work together and really make sure that the people who have the supply, right, the people who want jobs, are matched to the people who have the jobs over here, right? So that it's a good match between supply and demand. So those relationships are so important. The other place I recommend you work with is workforce development agencies. And they're going to need help. They have a law now that says they have to serve people with disabilities, and they don't really know how. So if you can get on workforce development boards and you can engage those workforce development systems within your state and say, here's our employment needs coming up. We're going to need computer people and we're going to need HR people. And how can we work together to get those certification programs, those training programs in place and make them accessible to people with disabilities? So we get all kinds of people out of those training programs that teach those middle skills. And so just make sure that you're thinking about that talent pipeline for all the levels of your organizations and building those relationships to benefit all the jobs that you're going to have. Too often, companies think, I'm going to hire people with disabilities, but they hire them only at entry-level jobs. And really, to get to the inclusive workplace that we're trying to get, you have to have people with disabilities at all levels of your organization, not just entry level, but those middle skills jobs in the C-suite. All of it is really going to be important. If you go to the next slide, there's a number of resources that I wanted to share with you to get you started. And these are all for free, all on AskEarn. One is research that we did on online recruitment and outreach to people with disabilities. We did some studies with people with disabilities who were seeking jobs online to find out what attracts them or what makes them apply to a company. And so that research brief gives you the results of that study. And we talked about company website disability inclusion. Again, what are some of those factors that people will look for on a website? And it includes things like diversity statements, pictures that include people with disabilities and other diverse groups, things like that. There's one on job descriptions and announcements that talk about the language you use in job descriptions and how they invite people with disabilities in. And there's also a checklist for job descriptions that allows you to go through and check your job descriptions to see how you did. But branding and messaging, right, is critical. You have to have a website that opens the door to people with disabilities to begin recruiting people with disabilities. So if you go to the next slide, I want to talk about hiring and keeping the best. We generally speaking, companies are better at getting people with disabilities in the door than they are at keeping them, especially people who are applying at those middle skills or higher level skill jobs. And so it's not just, could I hire someone, but do they stay with you? Do they stay with you over the course of the year? So really, it's more than just, is my recruiting website friendly? It's also, what does the employee experience look like? And I cannot stress enough, again, how important ERGs can be in that pipeline. But you have to give them voice, right? They have to, the ERG, Employee Resource Group, has to have a clear mission that says this is why we exist, and it's to support employees with disabilities in the organization, but it's also to inform the organization of how they're doing on disability inclusion, what's not accessible, what needs to change, what's helpful, what's not helpful. When this happened, this is how it was received by your employees. And I'll give you an example. And poor Cornell, I work here, I always use them as an example. But in the aftermath of the pandemic, right, when Cornell said, okay, everybody, it's time to come back to work, because we worked at home for 2 years, they made a rule that faculty, academic faculty, had to be on campus. And they said, you cannot request a reasonable accommodation to work remotely, period. You can't. And we all know that working remotely or accommodations is an interactive process that are individualized, right? So you can't, it's very not smart to make dictates like that. So A, they've opened themselves up to challenges, right, legally. But B, they have sent a very clear message that they don't really mean disability inclusion, right? And when I push back, that was my thing. It's like, do you realize how this was received? And that is a big deal, because it's the everyday lived experiences that really inform people of what's safe and what's not safe. Okay, so off the soapbox again, I apologize, I do love it. We have to ensure that all aspects of the recruiting and hiring process are accessible. I put a blue link under interview process because, again, we have some resources in that area of how to do accessible interviews. What are some of the things you should think about? How do you invite people to ask for accommodations? Because all of those things are important. My philosophy on accommodations is to leave the door open, to invite people in. So during the interview, do you say, is there anything you need to participate in the slide or in this interview process? And it's really important that you're continually opening that door. And then the other thing is make sure your onboarding process is accessible. So you hire a person with a disability and you say, okay, it's training day. And they go to the benefits discussion with HR, and they can't access any of the forms. Or they go to training and they watch a video or a web course that they have to watch for, say, sexual harassment. I think everyone in the world has to watch that. And it's not captioned and they can't read it. I mean, that's a message that you're sending. And again, if you want to keep people, then you need to make sure all of those pieces are accessible. All right, next slide. Retention is unfortunately not something that gets a huge amount of attention. And it's so important because, again, keeping people is work, right? You have to make sure that people are happy. And I will say, this is where training managers and supervisors is critically important. When you have an employee at whatever level, the person they interact with the most on a day-to-day basis is their supervisor or their manager. So teaching the managers all they need to know about reasonable accommodation processes, how to not be weird around disability issues. I went to a session yesterday, the National ADA Symposium is right now, where a group of rising stars with disabilities were talking about their experience in workplaces. And they say the number one thing that will turn me off from a job is if my manager won't talk to me, or they're kind of weird around me. that makes me want to leave right away, because what do you do with that? You can't make someone be nice to you. You can't make someone treat you equally. But having that manager just be weird around you is enough to be like, I don't think I want to be here. So it's really important to make sure you change your managers. Make sure also that you're providing access to those career development opportunities. People with disabilities can and do travel. So invite them when you go to leadership training or whatever training it is, skills building training, that people with disabilities are included on that roster to go as well. You also want to make sure that you've implemented policies that support advancement and retention. Do you have mentor programs? Do you have opportunities for people to upskill or reskill? Do you have opportunities for people to, connect with their colleagues in a broader area, like in an ERG? All of those things. But again, use that employee resource group to help build community and address issues and concerns of the employee experience across the whole employee experience. All of those things are important. Just checking my notes to make sure I touched on everything. So the other thing I will say is the policies that you set and how you communicate about those policies. Policies that sit in a drawer and only get dusted off every once in a while aren't as effective as policies that you say, we have this policy to benefit our employees, and here's what our workplace flexibility policy looks like. We have this policy to benefit our employees, and here's what our reasonable accommodation policy looks like, and here's how you access it. So again, talking about all of that stuff is really, really critical. All right, next slide. Okay, let's talk about productivity. I love reasonable accommodations. I did a whole hour and a half on reasonable accommodations yesterday, so I can talk about this forever. Reasonable accommodations are productivity tools. At their heart, that's what they are. They enable someone who is struggling to complete one portion of their job or some portion of their job because of a disability to approach that work in a different way. So it's not different work, it's the same work in a different way. And that's really important to remember. And I think it's really important for managers to understand what an accommodation is and how they work. Because those are things that they don't always. To managers, it's an added expense. It's inconvenient. So there's a lot of built up anxiety around accommodations and how much it's going to cost me. I can talk about centralized accommodation policies or processes forever. But those are the things that you need to operationalize it. You need to make sure that everybody understands that these are productivity tools. They can reduce workers' comp costs. They can reduce absenteeism because people aren't struggling to do the work. So they really are great things. Okay, so I would tell you to communicate frequently about reasonable accommodation, not just to your managers and supervisors, but also to all your employees. COVID has created a lot of new people with disabilities. As people age, they're more likely to get disabilities. But increasing someone's comfort at work can increase their productivity. So make sure that people know that you want to give your employees what they need to work productively and successfully. All right, if you go to the next slide, there's some strategies that you can do. I think I talked about training managers on your accommodation policies and practices. So what does disclosure look like? Have you talked to your managers about that? It's their job. 60% of people, when they disclose to their manager. So the manager has to recognize that disclosure and elevate it to whoever is going to do that reasonable accommodation process. And they have to know who to elevate it to. So that interactive process can start. Again, I already said communicate to all employees. Make sure that someone's designated to triage requests and support requests so that people know where to go to ask questions. And also make sure you've implemented a formal decision process. There's nothing worse than asking for an accommodation and not hearing anything back for a month or 2 months or 3 months or 6 months or ever, right? Because then the company's really saying, I don't really care if you're successful. And there's always that thing of when we can get rid of you because you're not producing, right? So make sure your process is clear. People know who to talk to. Those are all really important things. All right, go on to the next slide. I see a question that I should answer. Hold on. It would be helpful to define people with disabilities. As you know, this is a very broad term. Yes, it is. So the ADA has a very clear definition of disability. Let's see if I can remember it because I did not write it down. So it's, you know what, I'm going to Google it and make sure I get it right because that would be embarrassing. But disability is basically any kind of functional limitation that that limits someone's ability to perform activities of daily living. It also now includes bodily functions. All right, I got it now. Are you ready? I can tell you what it says legally. Oh, they didn't do it. Okay. It is a legal term and it's not a medical term. The ADA defines a person with a disability as a person who has a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities. And those are things like walking, seeing, hearing, all of those kind of basic life things. But when the ADA Amendments Act was passed, it also included things like major bodily functions, so reproductive systems, immune function, endocrine function, all of the things that would include things like diabetes and HIV/AIDS and autoimmune disabilities. But basically, you should never think too hard about what a disability is. What you should think about is, does this employee have an issue that we can resolve easily with a reasonable accommodation? That could be things like carpal tunnel. That could be things like a back injury. All of these can be disabilities under the ADA. It's a very broad term. So those are all things to think about when you're looking at a definition of disability. When we did a study of what do small businesses need to know about disabilities, we actually created a comic that highlighted what disability is. And I will put that in the chat for you later on. So you can go look at the small business toolkit that uses that comic to define disability, because small businesses are like, yeah, if someone is blind or they use a wheelchair, then they have a disability, but it's so much more than that. People with mental health conditions, anxiety, anyone who has a disability that really interferes with the way that they live their lives, or that people would normally live their lives without the presence of that condition. It can be a disability, and really the ADA says it's broad. So just assume they do. You can get the paperwork to confirm that someone has a disability if they ask for a reasonable accommodation. But it's just about what is the person having trouble doing. It's not about their full medical history. All right, I better get back to this or I will never finish. And I do see that other question, John. I'll get to that at the end. So communication. Start with leadership, but don't stop there. So make sure that you're having your leadership say, this is my experience with disability. This is why our organization has it as a corporate value, but also allow your employees space to share their stories. ERGs, again, super helpful in this regard, because they create a space for people to say disability is not just one leader who's the champion. It's at all levels of our organization. And this is what it means to have a disability at this company. All important things. Make sure you're communicating your policies internally for your employees and your managers, but also externally for the people that you're trying to recruit and get to come to your company and give their skills to your company. And make sure that the message, again, is one of inclusion and not one of compliance. So go on to the next slide. Talk about accessible technology. And this is really about your information and communication technology. So much of our work these days is online, even in places where they have warehouses or where you're dispersed across stores. So much of what we do is online. You have to make sure that your information and communication technologies are accessible. So that has to be at the hiring system. It has to be to your HR system for your existing employees. When you're making a decision about an HR system that you're going to use, like we use Workday, is that accessible to people? The consequences of purchasing something that people can't use with assistive technology can be incredibly expensive for companies. So make sure you're thinking about that in your procurement systems, and that people who understand disability and understand access to technology are involved in those recruiting decisions. Make sure that your technology people know the questions to ask. The iPad that I don't know exactly what it stands for. It's above my pay grade, but it's the statement that companies put to say whether or not their products are accessible. Will often say, yes, accessible, but it's at the very lowest level of accessibility. And it's not going to work for people who are using technology in really dynamic ways. So also you might want to think about adopting a specific technology standard, and that would be like the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. I think we're now at 2.1. The goal that most companies have is AA. So it's WCAG, WCAG 2.1 level AA, or the Section 508 standards. Either one is a perfectly good standard, but just make sure you have something to check against when you're evaluating technology. And that's what that gives you, is that checklist to say, does it do this? Does it do this? So that you're making sure that it's accessible. If you go to the next slide, I want to talk about data, everybody's favorite. You can do a lot of things in your company to try to establish that inclusive workplace. But if you do not collect data, you will never know whether or not they are successful. So you want to ask questions. If you do a training, were you able to easily get into the training? Could you operate the training? Did it successfully consider disability issues? All of those things that are, the lived experience of your employees. It also helps you really make decisions. When Section 503 first came out, the researchers here did a study on implementation. And very few companies were actually collecting data on self-identification. They have to collect whether or not people self-identify, but they didn't know why people weren't self-identifying. Companies then were around 2%. Most companies now are still at 2%. So we're not making a huge amount of progress. You should be actively encouraging self-identification, actively building that culture, because I can tell you that it's safety that informs whether or not someone self-identifies. When you had an experience like mine, where all of a sudden my skill level decreased overnight for something fully on my manager, I would never, ever, ever say again that I had a disability if I still worked for that organization. I do not. And that's the consequence, right? It's like, oh, well, that's how it is here. And you go. And also celebrate your success. If you collect data about self-identification and you were at 2% and the next year you were at 3%, share that with people and say, it looks like we're on the road to building an inclusive workplace. What else do we need to do? And get that input from your organization. All right, if you go to the next slide, that's our funding statement. Nobody wants to read that, but thank you, ODEP, for our grant. And go to the next slide. And that's it for me. So I'll answer the last question before I turn it over. And it said, I'm curious to know what the outcome was after you challenged the policy Cornell created around not allowing employees to seek accommodations. So yeah, that went well beyond me. I believe that it was brought in front of the Faculty Senate. And the discussion went from there. So they're still very much interested in having faculty on campus, but they recognize that they need to have an individualized approach, right? So at least they listen to the pushback, and that's important. John, is there any other questions? I think I'm early.
Yeah, I think we're good. You did a great job answering questions and covering the information.
All right, great. Well, then I guess we'll turn it over to Erica. And Erica works for Goodwill Industries of Southeastern Wisconsin. And I think you're going to talk about recruiting, right, Erica?
I am not.
Oh, darn it. Okay, sorry.
No problem. Thank you so much, Wendy. Good morning, everyone. Again, my name is Erica Eichmans. I am the IPS and Community Employment Supervisor at Goodwill Industries. So the IPS program, which stands for Individual Placement and Support, is a research-based practice to assist individuals with mental health diagnoses find employment. So for the past 3.5 years, I've served over 100 job seekers and connected with many local businesses. I'm also a facilitator on the Milwaukee County Business Advisory Council, which focuses on assisting businesses in creating a mental health friendly workplace. So I'll be giving some specific examples from local businesses and just effective strategies to implement the communication and measuring success components that Wendy spoke about. Next slide, please. So again, communication really just starts with the tone at the top. So if you don't have executive support, it makes it extremely difficult to develop a culture of disability inclusion in your workplace. I've worked with a lot of individuals at businesses that have been really supportive of, disability inclusion, but the policies and practices that are cascaded down from upper management don't allow them to support employees with disabilities effectively. Sometimes the bigger companies, the bigger corporations have certain policies and practices in place, with HR, with hiring, with retention that just do not provide that support. So I'm going to just share a couple examples right here in Milwaukee of businesses doing communication right. Next slide, please. Sorry, next slide. Okay, so I'm going to start with Goodwill. They really do a great job of visual representation of individuals with disabilities. And I think, some of you may say, well, it's easy. It's part of your vision. It's part of your mission. And that's true. And I think that does give us an advantage. But this screenshot here is from our job portal on the Goodwill website. So it's actually for hiring for retail services. This isn't a disability specific aspect of our website. This isn't an employment service information area for people with disabilities or our day services program for individuals with intellectual disabilities to find recreation opportunities. This is, hey, apply for a job at one of our retail stores. And it's that visual representation of somebody with a disability. I don't think it's a secret that people have an affinity towards others that look like them, talk like them, that they're similar to. So if you can foster that through visual representation in your marketing, in your talent acquisition, in your job postings, things like that, you're going to attract, that different kind of talent, and people will feel like there is a space for them. Next slide, please. So Mod Pizza, I just kind of want to share a little bit of my own personal experience, myself and a job seeker that I worked with. Mod Pizza, one of their sayings, they say it, it's all over the place. You can see it on their walls. It's literally painted on there. It's on their website. It's people before pizza. They say it all the time. And I think just in that, you can see the impact of external communication internally. because they're all over the walls. It's all over the website, like I had mentioned, but the managers, the leaders, just the general staff are saying that to each other. To share just a really specific example, I helped a job seeker of mine get hired at Ahmad Pizza in Milwaukee, and she has just had an incredible experience. She's been there just as a team member for about a year and a half. But just from the start, her managers, leads, coworkers were all supportive. She self-disclosed during her interview, about her mental health disability, and then it was maybe about 6 or 7 months into the job. She had to take a short leave of absence about a week. And she disclosed that it was for, she had an increase in her mental health symptoms. She returned to work the next week, and everybody on the team welcomed her back. Expressed how happy they were that she was feeling better, and back at work. And she said, she said to me, she said, "Erica, I feel like they actually saw my mental illness as like an actual sickness. Like my family doesn't even treat me that way sometimes." And what an incredible feeling to have that culture of people understanding, and really treating you how you deserve to be treated. That communication of people before pizza followed through, by consistent action. It really develops that culture of disability inclusion. Next slide. All right. So in my work with the Milwaukee County Business Advisory Council for developing and creating mental health friendly work cultures in Milwaukee, I've gotten to work pretty closely with Jakeem Jackson from the Milwaukee Bucks. He's just shared how in his time working for the Bucks, they've adopted a lot more up-to-date policies and practices to ensure that they're communicating to their employees and just, the community in general, that people with disabilities fit into their organization. One thing that they've done is created a really robust employee assistance program. It's part of their employee benefits. Every employee, part-time, full-time, receives this benefit, and it's highlighted during orientation. So it's not just, oh, here's information on our EAP. It's how can you access it? What things are part of the EAP, and how can you get the help and resources you might need. Another thing that they have implemented is unlimited PTO for full-time employees. And not only have they done that, but they really emphasize mental health days, taking a mental health day like a sick day, when you have a cold or the flu or something like that, and focusing on that so that they feel like their employees are taken care of. And it just creates that culture of, hey, we care about you and how you're feeling, and making sure that you're managing your stress appropriately. Another thing that they've done is they fund each employee's enrollment into Headspace. So it's an app on your phone for meditation and mindfulness. So not only is this just accessible at any time for employees, but they also use it kind of in various areas of the business during team meetings, things like that. Again, just for stress management, and that can be really helpful for people that have disabilities, that way to just maintain space and it becoming part of the culture of the organization instead of something kind of set aside for that employee to have to do, on their own, or try to seek out that accommodation to be able to do that. They schedule guest speakers very frequently to discuss how to maintain good mental health, how to treat somebody with maybe a mental illness or an intellectual disability, how that education is a really important piece of it. They also have created a diversity leadership council. Wendy talked about employee resource groups, ERGs, and this is one of them. So they're available to meet employees' needs real time. So it's made up of individuals in the organization with disabilities, without disabilities, people that have friends or family members with disabilities, so that they can really help change any policy, change any communication that may not be disability inclusive in the organization. Another just awesome thing I wanted to just kind of throw out there as a tool, a strategy, and maybe this is even a bit more so for hiring. So sorry, John, if I take some of your thunder here, but a tool, it's called Textio, Textio. It's a tool that was developed to help companies write better, more inclusive job descriptions. So Jakeem had found this, they decided to use it. And what it does is it takes your existing job description, it analyzes it, scores it, and makes suggestions on how to get a better score. So maybe the language that you're using in that job description is really consistent with how white men, for example, would read that and be attracted to that. So how can you make it more inclusive for somebody with a disability, for somebody with for somebody who's of color, and that way, you're attracting a different kind of talent because of maybe the buzzwords that you're using, ways you're portraying things, so that people with disabilities can look at that and see themselves in that role. Next slide, please. Okay. And I think it's just kind of an important question that you have to ask yourself as the leader of an organization. What do we want our employee experience to be in our organization? And I think a major part of this can be done through communication. Obviously there has to be that follow through, that action, but it's a great starting point. Policies, they should be reevaluated every couple of years at least, to meet the needs of the changing job market. The more information, the more data and research that we do to collect on, hey, what do people with disabilities need in policies in order to be successful? And making those changes so that the policies and practices that your organization, is doing are really best practices at the time. And then this employee first versus bottom line financial. I think a lot of times people think you have to be one or the other, but you can still focus on the bottom line and first and foremost be employee first. You can hold people accountable to meet expectations, but still create a culture that makes them feel important at work and like they fit in at work. Some other big barriers of organizations, I think seeing just the culture, not being able to create a safe space for people to self-identify or self-disclose, leadership not being on board. Again, the tone has to come from the top. Because not a single individual in the organization at a mid or entry level position can make that culture shift and change. And again, just focusing only on profit. There's a ton of research. EARN has a bunch of stuff on just how a bunch of research that they've done and studies that they've done on how, organizations lose out on money and employees aren't performing at the highest level because, they don't feel valued. They're not leveraging their creativity or their differences because of their differing abilities. And then I think the last thing in just thinking about this is just the diverse representation when you're creating policies and evaluating your practices as an organization. If you have input from all types of people, you're going to be able to get feedback on what's actually going to work and what's actually going to be beneficial for that organization. And for the people that are that the policies and practices are about and focusing on. So again, communication internally and externally is so important on the journey to maximizing disability inclusion in your organization. Next slide, please. Okay, measuring success. So, Wendy kind of talked about this, but, you really have to be intentional about creating goals in order for disability inclusion to be a focus in your organization. That way you can hold yourself accountable. And, it's impossible to determine success if you don't have anything to measure. Self-identification is a great way to track data. But a lot of times there are barriers that people often face when deciding whether or not to self-identify. They may think that they won't get hired, or they'll be fired, or they won't get promoted because they've disclosed. They think they might get treated or viewed differently by colleagues and supervisors. And it happens. Maybe they just want their privacy, or they don't think that their disability has an impact on their job performance. They also may worry that they would lose their healthcare benefits or something of that nature if their disability was impacted by that. And so I'm just going to share, a few ways that your organization can make strides in this space that can, so that you can overcome kind of some of those barriers to self-identifying and really creating supportive networks for individuals with disabilities in your organization. So I'm going to start with the Disability Equality Index. So this was created by the American Association of People with Disabilities, Disability In, and then it's kind of consistently being evaluated, reevaluated by a committee of business leaders. So this is a benchmarking tool that helps companies build a roadmap of measurable, tangible actions that they can take to achieve disability inclusion and equality. So it consists of measuring diversity, community engagement, accessibility, culture, and leadership. And then you're given a score on a scale of 0 to 100, and a detailed report is given to help you kind of assess the needs of your organization. For some people, for some businesses, that's a really big step, and you may not feel ready, and that's totally fine. But just looking at different hiring, training, policies, those are all great starting points for organizations that want to set strategic goals, that are surrounding disability inclusion. But again, if you're not measuring it, and you're not doing anything with that data in order to progress your organization, you're not going to move any closer to being more disability friendly. Kind of similar to creating policies, getting diverse representation and goal creation too. It's just going to ensure that the goals are actually beneficial for inclusion. And so I'm going to just share a couple of businesses that are doing the right things in this space. So you can go to the next slide, please. So employee resource groups, ERGs, a lot of times they come out of collecting that data that, was part of a strategic goal, or knowing that there's a need in your organization. So I'm going to share a little bit about Caterpillar, which is just south of us over the Illinois border. So they have a employee resource group called Abled and Disabled Employees Partnering Together. ADEPT is what it kind of goes by. And they share a story about a woman who is struggling with major depression and anxiety. And she found support in a community in ADEPT. Which is again, this ERG is working to make Caterpillar a disability friendly workplace by creating an inclusive environment for everyone. It drives a culture where resources and tools are readily available, to empower people regardless of their abilities so that they can be successful. One of the ADEPT chairs says, you can feel the relief from an individual when we are able to provide resources that they previously didn't feel comfortable asking for. That relief is only possible with education and communication about disabilities. So, they kind of noticed a need. Maybe it was from data that they collected, maybe it was from the self-identification process, but they saw a need for the ability to share out resources for educational purposes, and using that to help better support people at their organization. and something like this doesn't happen overnight, right? Maybe your organization doesn't get a high response rate from self-identification, but maybe a survey can be done to really kind of assess the opportunities that there are for employee resource groups. And a lot of times these employee resource groups need a sponsor that is executive level. So, your organization might have a diversity, equity, and inclusion leader. Otherwise, again, just an executive team sponsor to help create a blueprint. Who are they going to report to? What's their budget? What are the responsibilities? Is it going to be a social and educational group, both? And Deidre Garrett, she is Goodwill's diversity and equity inclusion director, and she's been doing this for a long time and has helped organizations develop ERGs. And she said that the biggest thing is that if there isn't enough internal support, the ERG won't be successful. So that it's really important for the higher up executives in an organization to take accountability in the success of the employee resource group, because it really oftentimes stems from there. Next slide, please. So self-identification, one easy way to kind of encourage it, and this is at Goodwill, this is kind of on, it's almost like a cover page to the self-identification that really just allows for reassurance, that there aren't going to be negative consequences, that, it is voluntary, and then what we use that information for. However, this is done at orientation. And that can be a scary place to decide to disclose. Somebody may not know the organization or have a good enough feel for the culture. So sometimes doing a survey at some point on a certain month, is a great way to better assess what the organization needs and maybe the opportunities for employee resource groups. Maybe a survey comes back and you notice that there are a lot of individuals that are self-identifying with, with mental health diagnoses. And so maybe that's the kind of employee resource group that you're going to create. And another thing that Deidre had mentioned was that just trying to pick and choose, start small and work your way up. If there are a lot of mental health disabilities, creating that, and not just creating employee resource groups for the purpose of it, to just say that it's there, if it's not really being taken seriously and work isn't being put in to help, increase that. So, and this is a story that Deidre shared with me. She was working for a different organization, and she had worked with an individual for probably over a year, and they were on different teams, but would kind of cross and collaborate and things like that. And this individual was very quiet at work, kind of at the start of the pandemic, would never turn their camera on, wouldn't be super engaged, would meet their expectations, get their work done, but just kind of felt like this person was just kind of going through the motions of their day-to-day. And Deidre saw this individual out at a restaurant, and they were laughing and smiling and engaging with friends and family, and she noticed that this was that this person had a partner, a same-sex partner. And so one day, a couple weeks later, Deidre went up to this individual and said, "Hey, I saw you outside of the work the other day. I just wanted to ask, do you feel comfortable being yourself at work?" They said no. And I think it's just so important because and this was kind of a quote from Deidre, that psychologically safe environments where people can be themselves, it just in general fosters a more productive, higher performing, more loyal, and engaged employees. And this is why that self-identification, self-disclosure, can be so important in the workplace, so that we can really get the best out of our employees. We spend 8 hours a day, 40 hours a week at work. And if we're not creating environments where people can be themselves, and whether that's having a disability, how they identify, there are, then we need to make some changes in our organization so that the culture is reflective of that. So I hope that some of these examples have inspired you, your organization. Sometimes the best place to look, for strategies and tips and ways that that might be successful is just right in the community, to see how other organizations are making disability inclusion successful. So yeah, you can go to the last slide then. Please, reach out if you have any questions or, kind of want to talk any further. I'm going to introduce John Bryson, the Learning and Development Director at Rangam Consultants.
Thank you so much, Erica. And I don't think I mentioned this when we first met, when we were planning this, but I actually started my career in adult services at Goodwill in Northeast Ohio.
Oh, did you?
And I
So
would
funny.
not be where I am in my career if not for my time at Goodwill. So
Yeah,
love what you're doing. Really impressed.
thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Well, hello, everyone. My name is John Bryson. I'm the Learning and Development Director at Rangam Consultants, Inc. Really excited to talk with you today. If you could go to the next slide. So I've been in the disability space for over 17 years, working as an educator in secondary and post-secondary, working in adult services, whether it was vocational employment or vocational rehabilitation, working with thousands of people with disabilities on an individual, group, and sort of scale level. And then also many years as a consultant, helping companies build programs to attract, support, and retain talent with disabilities nationally, even internationally. And now really loving the work I'm doing at Rangam in the learning and development space, which is really my first true passion, teaching, right? And I think there's another important piece of information about me. I have ADHD. So, listening to Erica and talk about creating that environment where people disclose, and Wendy touching on that as well. I disclose every time I do a public presentation, but I know the minute I do, people's perceptions of me change. So when they talk about the importance of creating an environment where people feel safe, even for someone like me who knows everything there is to know about disability to some extent, I still recognize that in some ways I put my safety in jeopardy in some ways. So it's so important to really foster that environment. Now, the other thing I wanted to touch on, there was a question asked about the definition of disability, and Wendy, talked very well about that legal definition the ADA provides. And to be quite honest, there are a lot of people in the disability community who take issue with that definition because it highly emphasizes limitation and impairment. And, I'll tell you a story about my experience being someone with ADHD. When I got diagnosed as a child, the physician did not look at my ability to communicate better than other children, or my creativity or ability to understand complex issues, didn't look at my ability to empathize with almost anyone immediately, like we'd known each other forever, even as a kid, which was kind of unusual. Those are all strengths I have because I have ADHD. If I didn't have ADHD, I probably wouldn't have those things. And it's because of those things, honestly, that I'm where I am in my career, that I'm able to do the work I love. That's not what the physician looked at. What they really used to assess me was my ability to sit still and focus for extended periods of time, particularly on tasks I wasn't good at or not that interested in, which quite frankly just seems kind of mean. And that experience that I had is very similar to the experience a lot of people with disabilities have, where people in their lives, physicians, adults, even support systems, tend to admire the things that are considered challenges rather than focusing on the strengths that people have. And that's really the medical model of disability in a nutshell, really looking at a person with a disability and comparing them to someone without a disability and using the limitation as the defining characteristic. And so one thing I would like to suggest in terms of just trying to define disability in your own mind and sort of navigate that. There are legal definitions, there are requirements from a business perspective that are important, but the way we think about people, we can't let that sort of business and legal definition affect how we think about people. So the social model of disability, in my mind, is a much more effective approach to creating an inclusive environment, because what the social model gets us to do is really ask the question, where does limitation come from? Is it inherent in the person and their disability? Or is it possible that the way we create our environments and our systems and our procedures and even the expectations we allow ourselves to have of others, is it possible that those things actually create limitations for people? And use the ADA as an example. Prior to 1990, which really wasn't that long ago if you think about it, if you used a wheelchair, you had a real limitation to access spaces you needed to get into or wanted to get into. And quite frankly, you couldn't get into those spaces without a lot of support. And it wasn't your fault. It was because of the way those spaces were designed. And once the ADA came along and society started to get into compliance with federal law, we saw curb cutouts and ramps and elevators become widely available. And all of a sudden, we saw this limitation evaporate for millions of Americans who use wheelchairs. And this is just one example. That's an obvious one, but I really want to encourage you to think differently about the concept of disability as a whole, because it really does affect people the way society largely views disability. Now, that was my soapbox, Wendy. So I'm going to get off mine real quick. So I want to say I appreciate Wendy, Erica. You shared wonderful information about creating and cultivating that inclusive workforce for people with disabilities. And I'm really honored to add to this conversation. So I'm going to share some strategies that will aid in attracting, supporting, and retaining talent with disabilities, from outreach and recruiting to just creating a support ecosystem. So if you could go to the next slide, I did want to highlight, I know Tracy sort of touched on what we do here at Rangam, but it's really important. I love it. I can't talk about this stuff and not share this. So as Tracy mentioned, Rangam is a minority woman, disability-owned global workforce solutions forum. That's a really important component of who we are. We live diversity and inclusion at the highest level of our organization. It's just baked into our DNA, really. And we were founded in 1995 by our founders, Nish and Hetal Parikh, beautiful human beings that still to this day run our company as the CEO and president. And Tracy also mentioned earlier something really important about what we do, and that's that our philosophy of empathy drives innovation. It really affects every single thing we do. And so we believe empathy is the single most important characteristic a human being can have. And it's also one of the most vital components of cultivating a truly inclusive environment. So when we talk about wanting people to be comfortable and feel safe, and the research Wendy mentioned that suggests not being your true self has really significant negative impacts on people and serious consequences in many cases. If you really want to foster an environment where people can be their whole selves, their true authentic selves, empathy is a vital component of your success with that, regardless of what strategies you implement. So I did want to touch on that briefly. And if you could go to the next slide. One of the ways that empathy manifests in what we do is our belief that we believe in employment for all. And so we couldn't be a company that believes in employment for all if we didn't recognize that there is significant inequity when it comes to employment for people with disabilities, especially if you start looking at specific types of disabilities like intellectual disabilities or autism, for example. So currently, unemployment is double what it is for people without disabilities. And it has gone down recently, which is phenomenal to see. But in my entire career, it's still been double. And nothing anyone has really done has changed that fact. And not only that, but unemployment isn't really a good reflection of just how many people with disabilities are disengaged from the workforce or underemployed. And so the issue that people with disabilities face, the systemic barriers they encounter, are vast and require our entire community of business professionals, experts, working alongside organizations that support people with disabilities, advocate for people with disabilities, and especially people with disabilities themselves to address these systemic issues. So one of the ways our company seeks to tackle this issue is through our program called SourceAbled. So SourceAbled is our autism, neurodiversity, and disability employment program. And it's been designed to help companies attract and hire qualified talent. And we also help our clients build inclusive and sustainable work environments that ultimately support the talent and support that inclusive hiring at scale. And so we've seen a lot of success with this. We use our proprietary technology and our innovative services with a team of subject matter experts. And because of that, we've reached over 1,500 placements of people with disabilities with our clients since launching SourceAbled. We have over 35 active clients right now using our services and over 9,500 candidates with disabilities registered in our SourceAbled system. So I'd say the future is looking really bright, even just from our small vantage point. And there's a lot of exciting things happening, but I did want to highlight this because it's just something that gets me excited every day. So if you could go to the next slide. So one of the things that we do here is we implement a strategy that's really focused on one of the things Wendy mentioned, which is building that talent pipeline. And a key area that we focus on with building that talent pipeline, because this is a significant challenge for a lot of businesses who are trying to attract talent with disabilities, building that talent pipeline. So we spend time and resources and invest our team in outreaching to partners, because we recognize that if we do outreach today and invest the time today to build these relationships, not only do we get talent today for the positions we have open for the clients we have, but we're building pipelines for future talent that will continually provide us that stream of qualified candidates, which continues to grow the talent community that we represent. So we see this as being a critical component of what we do. And it's really allowed us to be very successful. So establishing those outreach efforts that lead to sustainable and sustainable relationships for recruitment resources is very, very important. So recognize there are a couple different types of partnerships that you could build. So I did want to briefly touch on them just in case you're not really familiar with some of the nuance of these different types of organizations. So one, which is very common, are these sort of disability service providers. So Goodwill is a great example of that. There are many that are local, only existing in a particular market. There are some that are regional. They may operate across many cities or a large portion of a state or maybe multiple states. And then there are some that are national, like Goodwill, for example. But even the large national organizations have regional pockets that are managed and run by different individuals. So they can vary from area to area. And those relationships can give you access to talent that are receiving services designed to help them with a variety of things in their life, not just employment, but employment is a big one. So they may have access to job coaching services that help them learn their job or perform their job well. They may have access to services that help them find careers or understand what their skills are, maybe even just put together a career plan to figure out what steps they need to take to be more qualified than they are. So there's lots of different types of services in there. Vocational assessments, I find to be one that's very helpful for many candidates. And there are other services many of these organizations offer. Not all of them offer the same services, but many of them do offer things like transportation, for example, or essential services they may need in their home just to help them manage some of the things outside of work that help them be more productive when they're at work. So they're a great type of partner, and engaging with them is, I find, to be really rewarding, and there's lots of benefits to reap from those relationships. Another really common one is just generally partnering with government, and the most common one that I see in that way, Wendy kind of mentioned, is vocational rehabilitation. Every state has a vocational rehabilitation agency. So, in Wisconsin, you have a strong one, and that vocational rehabilitation agency receives government funding, federal and state funding, and they use those funds to provide essential supports and services to individuals with disabilities who are trying to obtain employment. Maybe they're trying to maintain employment, and candidates may be at a variety of places in their career path, but it's a great way to access talent, to work with really professional partners who are very knowledgeable about employment and often have the infrastructure to build great relationships. So they're a really solid partner. And Wendy mentioned too that there's ways that you can partner on scale with VR as well. So not just state by state, but there's some ways that you can partner in regional and national ways. And then the last one I'll talk about, I actually find to be the greatest return on investment when it comes to accessing talent. I mean, ultimately, if that's what you're trying to do here is build outreach that leads to creating a talent pipeline, colleges and universities are one of the greatest sources of talent for business. And there's a couple different ways that you can approach this. Every university, every college is different in some ways in their structure. There are similarities, but in general, most of them have some type of career development service they provide to all students. And that would include students with disabilities. And it's really important to recognize that regardless of what university you're working with, there is no guarantee that students have disclosed their disability. So even if they have disability services, if that student hasn't disclosed, then your only connection point really to that student is through career development services. So they're a really essential partner. The other component I mentioned is the disability services, and these departments exist to make sure that students with disabilities have access to the support services, accommodations they need to be able to thrive in the academic setting, succeed, graduate, and be able to thrive as a professional in whatever their career choice is. And so disability services can often be a great potential partner, but many times what we find is one of the greatest partners are when a university has a disability specific program or some type of a additional employment focused program. And those tend to be great partners because they're intentionally doing outreach to work with businesses and creating lots of engagement opportunities. So a couple different types of partners I wanted to cover here, but really the key is invest the time to build those relationships now, because it's going to pay dividends in the future. Having those pipelines in place are going to lead to talent for future years to come. Next slide. Now, some of the benefits of developing these partnerships are things you may not necessarily consider, but I've seen these all in action. So first, I'd say raising brand awareness about your company. So it's pretty clear that there's no guarantee you could expect these potential candidates to even know your company exists or understand your mission, your culture, your values, the types of career opportunities you have. One question I get all the time from college students is, how can I tell if a company has a disability program? And many companies do not make that information very easy for a random person to find out. It's generally targeted marketing. And so, students are looking for information about companies that want to hire talent with disabilities. These types of partnerships give you the opportunity to provide that type of information. So really, really valuable information that you can provide. But there's a couple levels of engagement from a branding standpoint. You could seek to keep it simple and just create brand awareness. And in that case, maybe you add these potential partners to a distribution channel, or maybe you do targeted marketing focusing on promoting an event you're doing, or a webinar series, or a new product, or career opportunities that you have available. I know many companies I've seen who've used these partnerships just to promote internships that they have. So you can keep it simple, or you can get a little bit more advanced. Maybe you seek to create sponsorships with universities and fund research, or fund students and scholarships and raise awareness that way. You could do white papers. I've seen many large organizations with neurodiversity programs, autism programs, disability programs partner with universities to put out white papers on issues that are employment and disability related. And those have been really impactful. I've seen organizations businesses partner with these organizations to do a series of webinars. A disability service organization in Chicago partnering with business to do a joint venture webinar, to maybe do a lunch and learn series. I've even seen organizations partner on grant applications just to try to increase the scale and scope of what it is they're trying to accomplish. So there's a sort of level that you can go. You sort of choose what you want to do. You can keep it simple, or you can get a little bit more advanced. There's lots of potential when it comes to raising brand awareness about your company. The other thing that's really valuable is if you schedule a cadence of time with these partners to connect with them. It could be monthly, it could be quarterly, but enough that you can maintain the relationship. That's key. Relationships are bidirectional. They need to be mutually beneficial, right? So it's not all about you and it's not all about them. You have to share with each other. And in that process, that gives you the opportunity to do two things. One is share information about your current and upcoming needs. You can tell these partners what you're looking for in terms of skills, in terms of new technologies that are coming out. Maybe there's characteristics of potential candidates that you're looking for these organizations to help cultivate. Maybe you've realized that honesty is the most important aspect of any employee. And so you share that information with these partners, and then they can then impart that upon the individuals that they support and serve. But it also gives you the opportunity to learn about and gain valuable insight on the disability community. So maybe you learn more about autism or other disabilities. Maybe you learn more about the systemic challenges that individuals face. Maybe you use it as an opportunity to do a focus group with students and ask them, do an audit of our talent acquisition process and let us know what are the things you find to be most challenging. A business that I know did that and found that they had too many requirements in their job postings, which was something that was mentioned earlier. And Erica shared a resource. I'm forgetting the name off the top of my head, but I did post it in the chat for us, and we'll share with you later, Textio. And that idea is to really create a more inclusive job posting. Well, this focus group helped them identify that they were expecting people to have 10 requirements, and all of the autistic candidates didn't apply if they didn't have all 10, when the reality was the company didn't expect every candidate to have all 10. And, so they weren't clear in their expectation, and the company learned a lot about how to rewrite job descriptions just because of this focus group. Gave them opportunity to gain that insight about the disability community, gave them access. And then there's another component to this too, which is that you can't expect anyone really to be more of an expert on your industry than your own company, because you're doing it every day. And so you have valuable assets, valuable resources, valuable insight to share with these partners about the industry that you operate in, expectations or standards, for example, new technologies, and then career specifics, things that are essential for people to thrive in those careers. You have lots of great experts in these partners for sure, but you definitely have information to share with them. And so there's a lot of benefit, because if you provide that information, not only are you building a talent pipeline for the future, but you're setting them up so that they are even more qualified for you in the future. Next slide, please. So another thing I want to talk about relates to that idea of that sort of bidirectional, mutually beneficial relationship. So that starts with understanding what these partners want. What are they looking for? What value do you add to them? Because you see the value they add to you. They give you access to talent, the potential to build a pipeline, the potential to raise awareness about your brand, all these things I mentioned. So what's the value you add to them? Well, the reason I listed out these types of partners and not many others I could probably mention is because they all share something, and that's that they have a mutual interest in helping the individuals they serve obtain employment. Now, that might mean a first career, that might mean long-term success with skill development, but essentially what these organizations want is for the individuals that they're serving and supporting to thrive, to succeed in their lives, and employment is an essential part of that. And so you can help that along, because we know unemployment is a significant issue for people with disabilities, right? And I'm going to talk in a moment about some strategies we can use to make ourselves more inclusive as businesses in the way that we approach recruiting talent. But one of the things we know, if unemployment is very high, is create opportunities for individuals to gain experience. That's one of the number one predictors of post-school success, is actual paid employment. So offering internship opportunities. Many of these universities, for example, have internship programs, and they spend a lot of time just trying to find businesses to partner with to create internship opportunities, and have a variety of different types of internships at a variety of levels. So individuals get great experiences. Also, career exploration. So it doesn't even have to be an internship, but maybe I'm a student maybe I'm in my 10th year, or maybe I'm receiving services from an organization and I'm looking to do a career change. And I just want to know a little bit more about different careers before I make the leap into investing in schooling or training or some type of educational program. And it'd be great for me to be able to spend some time job shadowing or doing an informational interview, or even just doing mock interviews with someone to kind of practice how I would interview in this type of industry. Those can be really valuable ways to invest. And that's, again, mutually beneficial. Apprenticeships are obviously a little bit more complicated, but a great way to partner. And, you can partner with an organization that can help you write curriculum, that can help you implement curriculum. There's all kinds of really interesting things there. And then, of course, just general learning engagements. We do this all the time. I present regularly on disclosure to individuals with disabilities in partnership with other organizations. And so I'll tell individuals how to weigh the pros and cons of disclosure and what the benefits are, and maybe what some of the perceived cons might be, and how to make that decision so that it's right for them, and what to look for in a business so that they're properly evaluating whether it's good at a company, so that they can avoid the type of experience Wendy shared, which is just awful for people to have to go through. So all of those types of things are great ways to engage with talent and create opportunity for individuals to advance themselves. And that's really what these organizations are looking for. So lots of ways to partner. Hope you see some valuable things. Maybe something stuck out to you. Would love to get some questions in the Q&A if you have questions about specifics, but we'll get to those later. Next slide, please. So let's talk about some strategies. If we recognize that talent with disabilities encounters some pretty significant barriers, then what are some things that we can do? Well, we have three main suggestions that we recommend to all of our clients. We help them work through. We do this ourselves, and they're incredibly effective. So one is recognize that traditional hiring practices are designed to screen talent out. High volumes of candidates so that you can make easier decisions and sort of filter that pool. And in the process, that approach is really good at screening people with disabilities out early. And let's just look at an example. Let's say that you're expecting experience. Well, if we know unemployment is significantly higher for people with disabilities, then expecting experience off the bat creates a systemic barrier for someone because they may not have any. Or they don't have the exact experience you're looking for. Doesn't mean they're not qualified, doesn't mean they don't have potential to learn a job, doesn't mean they don't have the capabilities. It just means they don't meet that exact criteria the way it's written. And if you know applicant tracking systems, it's not looking for gray area, it's looking for exact, and it's going to rule them out. So these systems are really good at ruling candidates out. So what we recommend is going to approach creating strategies that allow you to screen talent in. Look for reasons to interview people, not for reasons not to. And this is one area we've heard from clients that has been profoundly transformative for them and changed the way that they do all recruiting, because they're actually finding better talent by looking for reasons to bring people in than looking for reasons not to bring them in. As you can imagine, that seems like common sense, but it really negatively impacts talent with disabilities. The other thing that I want to touch on is fixed versus flexible requirements. And so when I mention experience, it's important to have experience, and I'm not saying you don't expect people to have it, because there's many jobs where you need an experienced person, but the question is, what kind of experience do they really need? So I'll give you an example. We have a major client in the pharma industry, and on a recent call, one of their VPs mentioned from learning with us that if we're hiring people to work in a lab and they have to follow essentially a recipe, right? Then could we be looking in food service? Because if someone has food service experience, what do they have experience doing? Probably following a recipe or following a specific set of instructions consistently, time over time. And so because of that, they've been able to look at different types of experience, and that would qualify as experience. And that's become a more flexible requirement than a fixed requirement. It used to be very fixed, very specific type of experience, and now it's much more flexible. And so adjusting those requirements and figuring out what really is fixed. There are regulations, there are requirements, there are certain things you have to do, and you can't change those. But where can we be more flexible? Where can we look differently? I'll give you another great example. when we think about transferable work skills. We had a candidate that was looking to take on a sort of data analyst position, but he had no experience whatsoever. And he had one thing on his resume that suggested he had some skills, and he had a certification listed that didn't connect to anything else he had on his resume. And so we asked him, why do you have this certification? And he said it was self-acquired. He went and got it himself because he runs a Dungeons and Dragons group with his friends, and he manages this entire remote game and this database of information. And he taught himself how to do all of these amazing things, utilize all these really amazing pieces of technology. And he ended up getting the job and was incredibly successful because we were able to then pitch him as a candidate for this position, because we were able to make that connection between his transferable skill and they were more flexible with their expectations of experience. So those two things met, and they got a great candidate out of it. And he happened to be an individual on the spectrum. So these are some great suggestions for things that you can implement. It does take a little bit of strategy and thinking to approach it, but it's a really good starting point to have some important conversations. Next slide, please. So can you go to the, yep, thank you very much. So one of the other important components is not just getting talent, but keeping them, right? And you know, that's crucial. People with disabilities encounter a lot of barriers, not just getting the job, but once they're there, thriving, being successful, being embraced, having that sense of belonging. There's all types of things that happens. And so an atmosphere of inclusion is built on the idea that every person should bring their true authentic selves to work. And when it happens, everyone thrives. But the trick is achieving this cultural feat means that as an organization, you have to ensure beneficial supports are in place so people have what they need to thrive, right? And there's lots of other factors here too, you know, in terms of messaging and communicating to the organization what your values are, but the supports we find is a critical component. So if you could go to the next slide. One of the parts of our strategy that we heavily emphasize is creating a support ecosystem. So essentially what we mean by this is we see the talent as one part of this ecosystem of support. We also see their peers or their coworkers as another crucial component, and their mentors and managers as another crucial component. And this paradigm allows for all of them to thrive and succeed. It requires all three layers of support to be engaged in some way, to be supported in some way. It requires responsibility for all three in terms of maintaining this kind of ecosystem. And there's also a component that we establish with a sort of duration component. So for example, someone doesn't necessarily need a mentor forever, right? They might need a mentor for a period of time. There may be a need for someone to have a peer support for a period of time. There may be certain types of supports that are provided for a period of time. And so there's a durational component to some of these things, but essentially what we teach our clients to do is create this support ecosystem and really view that environment as a way for everyone to thrive. And so it hinges on the fact that if you provide support, you also need to be supported, because providing support isn't like it's just this free thing to do. Sometimes it can be hard, you know, it's not rocket science, and I don't believe it takes a lot of work, but you know, we don't want to forget that people who provide support need support as well. So it's a really crucial component of any successful program is sort of viewing the environment in this way, and really think it's crucial to understand. Now, the next slide, if you could, there's an aspect of this that I think's very pivotal. If you could just click through, I didn't realize I put them on animation. So the universal, just go ahead and click through all the icons, because I don't know why I animated them. That was a mistake on my part. So the thing we see a lot in the support ecosystem is the best types of support are the types of support where everyone benefits, right? So for example, it's not really a support, but for companies who aren't used to doing it all the time, it's a different approach. And so it's sort of viewed as a support. Making sure any task provided has a deadline is incredibly helpful for people who need to know what the expectations are, need to know how to structure their use of their time. And so a approach like that, if it's not something that's commonly done in an organization, is a universal support, because everyone benefits from knowing when work is due, when the expectation is. And so that type of universal support is really helpful. Another one is manager check-ins. So if managers make it a standard that they check in with each of their employees at a certain interval, everyone benefits from that time to find out, hey, how are you doing? Or you have any questions, any challenges you're encountering? This isn't something we should just do with talent with disabilities. It should be something we provide to everyone, because everyone needs that touch point periodically. Another thing that we see commonly is a manager might not be used to providing a checklist for employees, but conversation after conversation, what I learn is as managers start providing checklists to employees, not only does it help them think through projects more effectively when they provide them to their employees, it helps employees complete them in a quicker amount of time, more accurately, more effectively, and everyone benefits from this type of approach. So these are simple strategies that can be used that really emphasize this idea of universal design, which is originally kind of a principle that was established focusing more on environments, but over time has really translated into learning and the way we create systems and processes. So essentially, I'm not going to go over all the aspects of this for time purposes, but one of the things I want to highlight here is that when you think about creating a system, or you're evaluating a system, a process, really ask the question, does this system, this product, this process, does it create any types of barriers for people with disabilities? And if you aren't equipped to answer that question, then you might want to employ a disability employee resource group you may have, or you may want to seek input from an organization you've partnered with and ask them, what do you think about this system or process? Are we creating barriers? But if you are equipped to answer that question, and find out, is it yes or no? If it's yes, take action to adjust it before implementing it, because it'll make it more universally accessible if you do so. All right, next slide. I want to spend a few moments on here. So I wanted to just give you something very tactical, and I believe I saw that the slides will be going out, so you'll have this. So what I've done is, in terms of thinking about not just hiring candidates and recruiting them and building those partnerships to establish the pipeline, not just making sure that they stay, but also making sure when you have candidates, they can be as productive as possible and really succeed. Keep in mind, people want quality of life. Doing a great job at work is a big part of quality of life. You feel good when you do good work. You get promoted, you're able to advance. And so these supports aren't only just for people to do a good job, but you're also helping people live a fuller, better life when they can be successful. So I hope that makes you feel really good about doing these things. So I broke it into a couple categories. We have on-site employment and remote employment. We have process-focused support, structure, communication, and engagement. And what I wanted to do here is provide some mostly universal supports that benefit many, many people, if not all employees. And so, for example, one of the things we found with remote work is that inviting people to view being on camera as optional has really helped reduce anxiety, Zoom fatigue, and a lot of other things that impact mental health of being on camera all the time. Recording calls for reference is something that everyone benefits from, but kind of making it a standard practice for individuals who may have processing delay. Maybe they have a sensory processing condition. Maybe they need more time to kind of think through things. And so it gives everyone access to that information so that they don't feel the pressure and stress in the meeting of making sure they're capturing everything, because it's sometimes just very challenging for individuals. Under structure, offering uninterrupted focus time. This is sometimes a challenge for individuals, but maybe they have ADHD, or maybe they are able to hyper focus on a task. And when they're able to be more productive, but that means that we want to limit interruptions. So perhaps we schedule periods of focus time on people's calendars where they can work uninterrupted. Or encourage people to do that themselves. Invite them to, say, start their day with an hour of uninterrupted focus time, so that they can use the time of day when they're likely to have the most energy and fewest distractions, and be able to do the most creative work in the beginning of the day, for example. And then I mentioned check-ins and a variety of other things. So these are some great supports. You'll have these in the PowerPoint. So look forward to you checking those out. And I think what we'll do now is go to some questions. I think we have a few, and you can, yeah, this is our site. If you want to check out sourceable.com, you just go to www.sourceable.com and learn a little bit about us. And I think we'll go to Q&A now. Tracy, I see you're on. Any remarks you want to make?
Well, just fabulous. I want to thank all the speakers, definitely. And I think it's awesome that we had an opportunity to explore those 7 components of the disability inclusive workplace, and all the great information and strategy shared with the team from Wendy. Much appreciated on that. And then also Erica, really helpful on the internal and external communication and around the company policies and hitting on the self-identification as well. But there's a lot of different practices and things that you can really measure success. And I know that the self-ID is one area that's of, and disclosure that comes up quite a bit. And John, appreciate you going through and articulating a little bit more about, it's always good. I think it's great for us to all be champions. So I refer to the soapbox as we're all champions. And we're here to really take down those barriers and promote the great abilities and what we can all work towards in building a talent pipeline. And then what's really important is you want to retain that wonderful talent as well. So it was really appreciated, the panelists for doing that. And I think we've got a question that came in.
Yeah, so let's see here. We have one question that Wendy is going to answer that was asked earlier. I just have to find it because now I'm realizing that
I have it pulled up, John.
You have it pulled up? Okay, thank you.
So when I answered the question about the definition of disability, I forgot one part of the question. It asked to speak to recommendations around asking staff whether or not they have a disability in the spirit of equity inclusion. And I can tell you that other than self-identification, that's not a question that you should ask your employees. And it's really important that you don't do that. But as I said yesterday in the presentation I did on reasonable accommodation, what you want to do is keep the door open. And what that means is making sure that you're talking about that disability inclusive culture and who you want to be and what you want to establish. Letting people know that if they choose to self-identify as having the disability, they won't be treated any differently. In performance management discussions, you are always very careful to talk about the performance issue and not the reason for the performance issue. So yesterday, I noticed that you sounded really upset when you were talking to that customer. Is there anything you can do to tell me about that issue and how can I support you? So again, you're opening the door for someone to say, well, I've been having some mental health challenges, or with my disability, I get migraines and I just had a really bad headache. And then you've trained your managers to think about how are they going to react to that disclosure discussion. But you should not in general say, hey, do you have a disability to people? That's not a question you should ask people. I hope that helps.
That was a really, really great response. I somehow have managed to go my whole career without anyone ever asking me, do you have ADHD? I don't know how I've managed to do that, because if you know me, you definitely can tell. Okay, so we have another question here, and Erica, I feel like it relates a little bit to some of the things that you were talking about. So the question is, how do you recommend someone approach a leader in the company to bring to their attention a policy that may be unethical, exclusive, or inequitable? And you talked about accountability and communication. So I'm wondering, is that something you could touch on?
Yeah, definitely. So, I personally think that the best way to approach it, one would maybe to be talking specifically to your leader. whether, depending on how high up that is. I think just being authentic, being vulnerable about it, I think just really shows that you care. It's something important to you. Unfortunately, there are things that not everybody can do to hold other people accountable, right? It's kind of something that we have to do and choose on our own. And especially if, the organization isn't that way, there isn't, there are limits to what you can do. I think, talking to people that can actually have an impact or make a difference are going to be the ones to bring that up to, and it may even just be a conversation of somebody not understanding that policy is that way, or that it is exclusive or it's limiting for some people. So again, I think just communicating that, being authentic, and seeing if there's any way that you can get involved in that process as well. Is there a focus group that's talking about this? Do you have a diversity, equity, and inclusion manager, director, leader in your organization that you can go to and have that conversation with? Going to HR and saying, hey, I noticed this policy. Generally, that stuff has a tendency to get escalated up, especially if you're in a larger company. If you are in a smaller company though, just again, being authentic, and just showing that what that looks like, how that may be perceived, and making sure it becomes an educational thing. You don't want to go in and talk to somebody and make them feel bad about something that they've done or a policy that they inherited, maybe as a leader, but just kind of being open and honest about what that may be perceived as, in the market.
That's great. And I think Wendy, you had something that you wanted to add to that as well.
Yeah, I just want to say that I think a lot of times people who know more about a topic often have the responsibility to coach up. No one gives you that responsibility, but it's there. And just saying something, I wanted to speak to you about this policy and the consequence of this policy on people like me in the organization. I don't think that when Cornell said the thing about faculties needing to be on campus, they were solving a problem that they had. In that we're a residential college, the kids are coming back, they want teachers in the room to support the kid. So they're solving a problem that they have, and they're not always thinking through, how is this going to be perceived? What is the impact of this decision or this policy on my employees? And sometimes just someone going in and saying, well, you want to know about impact? Here's the impact, in a way that's productive and aimed at solutions rather than blame, like Erica said, is critical, to just point out to people. Now, like Erica said, they might not be able to change it right away, but understanding impact is the first step in creating a culture of inclusion. And so it's a really important thing to think through and to invite those kind of comments wherever possible.
I feel like both of your responses were like human wisdom just now. I mean, having difficult conversations in general can be really scary and stressful, but I think you gave a really great framework for how to do that. We have another question, Wendy. I think maybe this one we'll start with you, and then if anyone else has anything to add. So the attendee says, we're starting an ERG, and I can't believe how valuable this has been. Several of us in the ERG know or are family members with disabilities and are strong champions. Any thoughts on how to get the best result when the company believes they have good systems in place, but that may not be the case? Now, similar in some ways to this, but just what's your thought there?
So on Ask Erin, we do have a guidebook on how to establish an ERG. But I think what you might be missing is that connection to leadership and the feedback loop that is so critical to making ERGs meaningful. Many ERGs, when they first start, are support groups. They're for the people in the organization who care about disability because they have a family member, because they themselves experience a disability. And I think to get to that next level, you need to say, we want to help you get better. And how can we do that in a way that's going to be beneficial to you? and you can tell them there's lots of ideas all throughout Ask Earn, but that book is very helpful. ERGs can help in recruiting. They can help in policy setting and communication and storytelling. So tell them all the benefits that you bring to the organization and include things like informing best practices on making our employees feel welcome here. Include things like telling stories to increase self-identification numbers so that they see a clear benefit to creating that feedback loop in a way that works. I'll put the link to the ERG guidebook in Earn or in the chat for you, so that you can go look at that. But really, I think the feedback loop is the missing piece for you, to get beyond support into feedback to the organization.
That's great. Anyone have anything else they want to add to sort of the importance of getting an ERG maybe off the ground? I know that can be a really awesome, exciting time, but can be difficult. Okay. I want to draw your attention also to a resource that was shared. Erica mentioned Textio earlier, and I believe the link has been shared. I had never heard of that before, Erica, and I'm fascinated with it. It's amazing. I was looking at it while you were talking, just wow. Gives you the suggestion between two different words, and this word might resonate more with women, and this word might resonate more with men. It's just really, really cool. So thank you for sharing that resource. All right, let's take one more question, and then we will maybe give you guys some time back in the day. Wouldn't that be nice? So let's, Erica, this is a pretty simple one, but what's the difference between, you talked about both of these, but self-identification and disability disclosure? Like, how would you describe the differences between those two?
Yeah, definitely. So self-identification is essentially just the box you check on the application or during orientation, kind of whatever the process is of that organization. If you were to request a reasonable accommodation by law, there are certain things, and it gets a little bit murky with, what is reasonable accommodation. But the process of disability disclosure is personally and voluntarily choosing to tell a manager, a supervisor, a colleague about your disability. A lot of times during that process, is when most reasonable accommodations are made. So usually individuals, if they feel like they're in a psychologically safe environment, and they feel like it is within the culture of the organization to support people with disabilities, disclosing can just help them make some of those, small accommodations or adjustments to their work schedule, to, their hybrid work environment, to their on-site work environment, so that they can set up to be successful. So sometimes that self-identification piece, I think occasionally it gets used interchangeably. But that self-identification piece is just the box that you check, and that disclosure to an employer is really when an individual is putting their trust in their work family, in their manager, their supervisor, to be able to make those changes to help support somebody.
Great, thank you so much, Erica, and thanks to the rest of the panelists here. We had the opportunity to really have some great takeaways, and again, just so that everybody understands, that has joined us for today, is that you'll be able to access all this great information at the Disability in Wisconsin website, and it's underneath the resource tab, and you'll be able to get the information that was shared today, as well as the recording. So that will be great. I think one of the things we all need to remember, a great takeaway, something that Wendy, that you said, but everybody had great takeaways, but creating that inclusive culture, that's really, really critical first step. And so we really appreciate that. And again, why we go about hiring and having team members with disabilities, it shouldn't really be about the law. It should be because it's aligned to our core values. And it's just what we do. As John said, the universal approach, so many things that you see and do, it becomes universal in what you're doing. And, those reasonable accommodations, that Erica, you just mentioned, again, relating to, whether you self-ID or you're doing the self-disclosure, those reasonable accommodations also, when you step back and look at it, they can become very universal within your entire talent community that you have. So keep that in mind. And the ERG, compliment you on, the building and and creating an ERG that I'll use the word inclusive, meaning those caregivers are so important, and all the resources you can provide. And as shared by Wendy, it's a recruitment opportunity. It's a tool for, it becomes that part of the nucleus, I think, of how you attract and retain and create that inclusive culture that we started off the presentation with as well. So again, Erica, Wendy, John, thank you so much. And then behind the scenes, we've had some fabulous people that have been working with us and making sure that we can present this wonderful Disability in Wisconsin webinar to all of you. And I applaud them all and thank you for Katie and for Martha and Jennifer. And then also Ashley for joining us as well. So thanks again. And I want to just remind you that we do have another session that's scheduled on August 11th, and it's going to be about employee retention. You heard a little bit about that today. So about creating an inclusive and accessible workplace with successful career paths. So please join us for that. And again, thank you all and have a wonderful rest of your day.